Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Xavi Schelling. So welcome to the podcast, mate.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for coming on. Really do appreciate your time. I know it's, as we discussed, a pretty wild time with lots going on, especially over there. So I really appreciate you fitting me into the schedule as you get back to playing. But anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving a bit of background on you? What you're doing at the Spurs, what you've done previously? Yeah, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm the director of performance, sports science and performance at the San Antonio Spurs. This is my sixth season. I'm born in Barcelona. And when I was 3, actually, I moved to Argentina, where I spent 6 to 7 years, and then I went back to Barcelona. I started playing basketball at that age, about 9 years old, and basketball has been my sport since then. I did a degree. I have a degree on sports science. I have a couple masters on exercise physiology, team sports performance, advanced research techniques. I have a PhD on exercise physiology as well. And before moving to the US 6 years ago, I was in Spain, in the Spanish First Division, in basketball as well, for 10 years. So that's pretty much it. 15 plus years professional basketball, and that's my background.
Nice. How did the move to the US come around?
Yeah, that was a weird time, actually. It's one of those things. I don't remember the San Antonio Spurs in 2014. They are looking for a sports scientist. They are actually competing at the time for the title. Actually, they will win the title that summer. They contacted a headhunters company in the UK, actually, Sporting Health, I believe is the name.
Right.
They reached to this profile. I was one of the people that they reached to. I sent my CV. Honestly, it's one of those things that you never think it's going to happen, but you do it and see what happens. And the ball started rolling. I had several calls with UK first. Then there was silence for a few weeks. Obviously, they were playing the NBA finals. And then I started conversations with the franchise itself. And I had a final personal interview in San Antonio. And I was the lucky guy. And I could move right away.
So your first season in the NBA was with the NBA champions?
With at the time NBA champions. A little pressure.
Yes. How was that moving culturally for you?
It's brutal. It's a completely different. I mean, the people think that San Antonio and in Texas is pretty similar to Spain because it's close to Mexico and there is a lot of Latin culture here, which is true, but it's still completely different. It's all around. You need to be very flexible, open-minded, and adapt. Is probably what we miss the most is the food. And the good wine, but other than that, the truth is that even though there are a lot of differences, culturally speaking, here in San Antonio, it's very family friendly and very easy, very welcoming. So it was fairly easy, and especially this franchise is family first, and made things very, very easy for me and my family. So it was pretty easy.
What was the state of sports science over in the NBA? Back in 2014, were you one of the first sports scientists?
No, I think if I'm not wrong, Mark Simpson in OKC was actually the first sports scientist, actually from UK, probably you know him. But there weren't too many. I mean, just a handful. Less than 6 teams had the actual role of the sports scientist, applied sports scientist. Now that has grown, but I think that is something that maybe we touch later on in the conversation. But what has happened in the US is that there is like a transformation. There are some sports scientists with that role, and others are transformations within the organization. So the strength coach becomes the sports scientist. So depending on how you count the sports scientist, maybe I would say that now half of the teams have that role. Regardless of what's the background of the person that is covering that. Yeah. But it's still a long way to go.
So in terms of your roles and responsibilities, and I suppose that the expectation from the organisation in terms of what's expected of you as the sports scientist, how's that changed? Oh, has that changed over the last 6 years? Your role day to day and the expectation of you?
Yeah, I think that the first biggest change that I lived is the difference in how we in Spain see a sports scientist and how the US sees a sports scientist. And I think that this is a pretty important topic because I have this conversation with lots of colleagues. Do we need to call ourselves sports scientists, or are we just the strength coaches that know how to use Excel or R or Python? Well, I don't like to create new titles if you don't need them. But the truth is that there is a particular thing in the US, and it is that to become officially to become a strength coach in the NBA, you need to have the CSCS. That's what you are required, and that's it. The more experience you have, the more chances you have to become an NBA strength coach. Now, a sports scientist is something else, not better or worse. It's slightly different, and basically the difference is that the sports scientist is an objective thinker or a critical thinker that tries to have a method to search for an answer. And you can call that scientific method, even though there are philosophers and epistemologists that don't want to call it that way. But what I mean by that is that you have a problem, you have a question, and you have a way to approach it, analyze it, and create new knowledge. And that is you can use that methodology for any question. It can be for physiology, it can be for strength training, it can be for nutrition response, it can be for the business side and talent identification. But I think that difference is important. I don't know if the title is necessary to differentiate, but in Spain, a sports scientist was equal to a strength coach. But internationally speaking, sports scientists and strength coach have two clear, different roles to fill. And I think that difference is pretty important.
So, do you, with your position specifically at the Spurs, I don't want to. Please tell me if we need to move away. But are you is the strength and conditioning running parallel to the sports science, or
right? Yeah, no, that's a very good question. No, and that's why was my biggest difference, because I was coming from Spain where I was covering 50-50. I was doing all the sports science duties, data management, and reporting, data analysis, and execution of strength and conditioning sessions, workload management with the coaches. Here, basically, due to the staffs are bigger, there are more resources, human resources and economical resources. There is more specialization. So I was here my first year. I was just the applied sports scientist, and we had basically to create that field pretty much from scratch. And I was focused on that, learning how things were done in a 5-time NBA champion, which it's very important to keep in mind that context, and learning from that, learning the ropes, and seeing where my knowledge and my skill sets could help to the program. Instead of coming from outside and saying, okay, this is what we will do, it's just learn what they are doing because they have done it pretty well, and then implement on top of that. And that's what we did. So here, the sports scientist has a specific role, and we have then a group of strength coaches that focus on execution. Now, in my particular case, I can be more involved in the weight room and on court because I'm also a basketball coach and I'm also a strength and conditioning coach. So I feel comfortable with both. But a sports scientist can have other backgrounds. There are sports scientists that are psychologists, sports scientists that are nutritionists, sports scientists that are data scientists. And all those backgrounds are okay as long as you understand the context where you're working and what are your limitations in terms of knowledge. But I think that differentiation it's pretty relevant.
With the US and their traditional I suppose, route of S&C and that being more ingrained in the culture versus sports science. How important was that for you, and maybe one of the big reasons you got the job, that you were the S&C coach as well as the sports scientist? You were doing both rather than the pure sports science with very little understanding and, I suppose, integration with the strength and conditioning?
Yeah, I think or that's what they told me. I mean, I think one of the things that made them give me the job was more knowing about the sport, more than knowing about the strength and conditioning. And I think that that's very important because, and it's a very common mistake in sports science. You can be an outstanding data analyst or data scientist, or very good physiologist, but if you are missing the point of the constraints of the sport or the constraints of the competition or the constraints of the organization, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how much you know, it's going to be really hard to gain the trust and buy-in from the organization, and it's going to make it possible for you, and it's going to generate a lot of frustration for you and your colleagues to actually build something. I was starting the other way around, to be honest. As I said earlier, I mean, I was going to a successful organization, understanding the sports because it's the sport that I lived since I was a kid. So I was reverse engineering, if that makes sense, trying to learn from them and implementing little by little on that organization. On top of that, I've been a strength coach, so the way that I communicate with the strength coaches was way easier. Because I know what they like, I know what they dislike, and I know the interactions between the strength coaches and basketball coaches, and I think that integration was the key point.
You've done quite a bit of work in communicating in your research, in communicating the sports technology and trying to get people to understand the integration of sports technology and the process you guys have gone through when implementing it. Do you think the role of sports technology and the sports scientist have become very linked, and linked in a way that maybe for the outsider or even the insider, when someone says sports scientist, they just think sports tech guy, the guy that's on the laptop, the guy that's on Excel, in R, like you said. Is that still the case?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. And I say unfortunately, but I mean, it's understandable.
Of course.
Yeah, the generation and the production of technology over the last 10 years has been exponential. I mean, there is so much out there. And of course, if you are an objective thinker, in order to be objective, you need information to assess that information and to make an informed decision. And technology is a mean to gather that information, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is not having the same technology that your neighbor has, or having more technology that your neighbor has, or having more technology that the actual champion has. I mean, technology is very important to understand as a mean for your objective thinking to have the information to make better decisions. Keeping that in mind, one thing is gathering information. If that is the key component, there are two very important factors when you want to implement technology. One is actually three. The first one is it reliable and valid? So is the technology that you are trying to implement is telling what they claim is reporting? If yes, okay, next question is it answering a question or a need in your organization, or is creating a new question? And this is very common. So you are adding technology that is actually not solving a problem, is bringing new information. And we know that we have so much information right now that if you are actually adding more technology, not because you need it, but because it's cheap or good, or because you want to have the same as the neighbor, you are adding more complexity to your decision-making process, and you're slowing down and probably doing worse on your program. And the last thing is how easy it is to implement based on time and efficiency. Meaning, okay, the technology is answering your question, is valid, but it takes 3 days to run a report, or it takes 45 minutes for the player to actually gather the data. Yeah, technology is great, but it's not implemented. So you have to understand why you want it. You have to make sure that it's valid, and you have to make sure that it's implementable in your program, in your constraints, in that sport, and considering the background from the player and the staff and the organization. If all those three check marks are okay, then you can think of implementing that. The fourth question, if those three, which are pretty hard questions, are okay, is cost benefit ratio. So how much I have to invest and how much I'm gaining acquiring this technology. I think that those 4 points are a must in any vetting process. If you skip one of them, I don't think that the implementation will be successful. And if it's successful, maybe you lose credibility with the players because it's not reliable, or with your front office and management because it's too expensive for how often you are actually using it. So that's the criteria that we, in our research, try to share with our community and internally with our organization.
Simple question, hopefully. Would you go in that order?
The first one for sure. Is it covering a need, or is adding new? Probably that's exactly the order that I would follow. It has to cover first a need, second it has to be valid, third it has to be implementable, and fourth cost benefit ratio. Yeah, it's pretty much that. They can overlap, but it's pretty much that workflow. Yes.
With the technology that you implement there, and just your, I suppose, general beliefs rather than going into the stuff at the Spurs, would you encourage people who are trying to, or looking at different technologies, whether it be athlete tracking, to get that validity and reliability done themselves? And would you invest that time, whether it's doing it yourself or partnering with another organization, i.e. university, to make sure that is valid and reliable in your environment? And I've spoken to a couple of people about this. Matt Varley, who was at over in Qatar, now back in Australia, and Stu Cormack, both talking about this and how important that is. But I also know that there's practitioners out there who will just say, well, I haven't got the time or resources to be able to do that. But would you, no matter what the circumstance, would you always encourage people to do that?
I think that whatever it takes, you have to make sure that what you are using, it's valid. That's the first point. Second point, the companies, the technology companies, should be required to meet some standards, and we have to be the ones setting those standards. For instance, now the NBA and FIFA did it a couple of years ago as well. They are doing their own internal validation and making sure that the tracking devices that the teams are using are reporting what the companies are claiming. That's great. I mean, I think that that's the way to go. I think that we have to think even broader. I think that there has to be a third-party organization that takes care of vetting all technology. That's very common in the medical community. Why not in the sports community? We're moving millions of dollars. So I don't know if that's a branch of the Olympic Committee in each one of the countries. I don't know if it's an international branch, but that's not competitive advantage for everyone. That's a good for everyone. So I think that you will push the requirements in the technology companies because they have to meet that. It's not just adding new metrics. It's okay, are those metrics actually what you are telling us, and are those reliable? I think that what FIFA and NBA did is one big step. I think that the next step is having an international community that actually does that worldwide. If point 1 and point 2 are not there, point 3 is the user, and I've done it myself internally here and in Spain. You have to deal with third parties. We use a Software Research Institute here in Texas. It's a massive engineering institute that help us with all the technology to validate that. But in Spain, I did it with universities. I think that you have to do your homework, and because your credibility is at stake with the players and the organization, you have to invest as much as is required to make sure that the technology that you're implementing, you are confident. And those three levels are the ones that ideally we want a third party, but if it's not there, you have to do it.
The second point was answering a question, not creating another question. In terms of the technology that you've had experience with it in both locations, where does that question come from? Does that question come from you? Does that question come from coaching staff? Or a bit of a mixture of both, depending on?
Yeah, the way that I'm pretty structured mentally, and the way that that we implement technology where I've been is structured as well. And basically the background of the reasoning is we have two big groups, internal load and external load, and you want to, those are the questions. So you have, okay, I want to know more about internal load, I want to know more about external load. Then you define the KPIs for internal load and external load, and then you find the best technology to gather information on those KPIs. That's the reasoning behind what I want to acquire first. And as you know, external load is slightly easier because external load is basically what the player is doing, how much is moving. And there are tracking systems, computer-based tracking systems like Prozone, or in the NBA second spectrum now, Zebra in NFL. But now the internal load, that's different. I mean, it's a very broad field that each professional will define themselves. Is it the RPE and psychological and self-perception, the metric, or is it saliva biomarkers, or is it the rate of force development in a counter movement jump, is RSI, etc. It's on you to define what are the KPIs for you and your sport, and what is the best technology following those 4 points that can answer those questions. So the first step is I have a skeleton of questions that I want to answer, and then sometimes coaches are asking something extra, and you put that question in your skeleton and your priority list, and you say, okay, that's an important one, because actually the coach who is coaching the players every day is asking about that. So let's take a look at that and see a technology that's easier to implement, because it's going to be used if the coach is asking for it. So it's a little bit of proactiveness and reactiveness.
Point number 3 was easy to implement. Have you got some sort of process to assess how easy it is to implement? Check marks, what it does, what it can do, what it can't do. What's your process in making sure that box is ticked?
Yeah, I think that's not a checklist that we have. Okay. It's more we have any technology has to allow you for a trial period, right? And then you, in that trial period, you will engage the coaches that will use it. And in that trial period, you have to make sure that in your program, in your workflow, in the way that you structure your sessions on court, off court, on the weight room, that technology is implemented. In that trial period, you have to make sure that the coaches are not having to go out of their way to get that data, because that's going to happen the first month and it's not going to happen again. So that trial period allows you to try the technology and say, okay, this technology is answering a question that we have, and it fits our workflow. And those things together will make that the coaches will use it, and that will increase the frequency of data collection. And if you have more data collection, it's easier to make decisions, not with one collection every week, but with every session having data.
Another simple question, but I think it may be interesting for people to know. The trial period, and I know that sports tech companies are encouraging people to trial their product, to try to get it within the organization, getting people used to it, getting coaches expecting it, basically. But in terms of that trial period, what kind of period do you need to get the information that you want? I know the standard's like 4 weeks, but is that enough for you to get what you need?
Well, it depends on what type of data you are collecting. If it's let's say that is a full biomechanical assessment that you are trying, you will have a hard time, first of all, getting a trial period for a full Vicon system with force plates and blah, 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 blah. If you're lucky enough and you have it that time, and you are doing it once a week, I would say that one month is not enough, because you will have 4 exposures tops with some players. So maybe you want to try that for a longer period, maybe in off season, and demo it with your coaches. That's what we do with systems that require more time and are more complex. Other systems like, I don't know, a VBT device that there are 50 in the market, with a month is more than enough, because basically what you are testing there is the user interface, the data collection process, and the real-time feedback with the player. If that works, it's just making sure that the coaches like what they are seeing and that the system is customizable enough. So yeah, it depends on the technology. The more complex the technology and the less frequent the data collection, the longer the period to validate if that works or not. Yeah.
I spoke to Matt Price over at the LA Kings in ice hockey a few months ago. We started talking about innovation, and I was actually listening to that the other day as I was playing around with some of the audio that I've got, and I asked the question around where he thinks innovation for him comes from, and then he started talking about what you've discussed with, are you getting it because it's answering a question, or are you getting it because somebody else has got it? And I just wondered where you go for not only, well, I suppose, inspiration and innovation. Where are you looking? Are you looking at other countries, other sports, other industries for your, I suppose, inspiration to see what's coming next, to see what can be implemented at your organization?
Yeah, well, I think that first is important to define what innovation is, and innovation is a process, not a state. Is a process of change with the goal of achieving competitive advantage or improving performance. And when I say improving performance, I'm not just referring to winning more games, which is obviously the end goal, but improving performance in that sector or department or group or question. Now, okay, if it's a process of change to improve performance, there are 2 ways to do that. And Jorge Wagensberg was a thinker, a Spanish thinker, that defined innovation in 2 ways. It's what is called evolution, or what is related to incremental innovation, and the second way is revolution, which is a disruptive innovation. And I really like it. It's evolution or revolution. Revolution is the most attractive because it's really cool. If you have revolutionary innovation, you are changing the whole thing, and it's very spectacular. But the truth is that we should pay more attention to the evolution part of innovation, which means optimizing and exhausting optimization in each one of the processes that you have in place. And that's a very tedious and meticulous work, where you have to assess all the decision-making processes, all the assessment processes, all the training methodologies that you have in place, etc. It's endless. And try to answer the question, okay, if I invest this amount of time optimizing this process, how much better in terms of efficiency in time that the coach has to spend collecting the data and actually changing the workout, are we gaining? So there is like a reversed view in terms of innovation, where at the beginning, when you start, the gains are very minor because it requires a lot of learning curve for the coaching staff to adapt what you're trying to implement. There is a lot of gain because they're understanding it's perfect, they're investing time and improving the tools. You keep investing time and they are very good, and they are starting to not gain at the same rate. And then is when you have to stop in that field changing. That evolution makes organizations very robust and very robust is the word. And it's not that cool because it's behind the scenes that you are changing little things. But at the end of the day, when you look back 6 years, said, wow, it's a completely different way of working now than 6 years ago. And that evolution or incremental innovation, I think that is sometimes disregarded or is not we don't pay as much attention, and I think that that's critical. Now, disruptive innovation, yes. I mean, let's use virtual reality to work on skill acquisition. It looks really cool. It's a completely different. We have a whole room only for virtual reality where we use the data from the games, and then the player is repeating. Yeah, that's really cool. How many times you can do it? How much exposure the player can have, etc., etc., etc. Then we go back to that would be disruptive. That's going to be a game changer when it's implementable, when the cost-benefit ratio is reasonable, and when it's valid and reliable, and the immersion on the virtual reality is good enough. We don't need to get into details in virtual reality right now. But meanwhile, if you know that that's going to be disruptive at some point, you have to select how you want to get there. Maybe it's not stopping everything else and investing now in that, because you are losing maybe in processes that will have a big change in your program. So you have to select where you want to be disruptive and how you want to be disruptive, and not interfering too much on the day-to-day operations, and which processes need to be incrementally improved to optimize your program on a day-to-day basis. I think that differentiation in terms of innovation is critical, and it relates to what we were talking about technology before.
Do you think we're more comfortable with the revolution side of it rather than the evolution side of it? Ripping something out, starting again, going with new, going with better, rather than the slower, more methodical evolution? Do you think we're more, maybe not you, but I mean, I'm speaking as an industry. Yeah. I suppose not as an industry, as a society. Yeah. Really, yeah.
I honestly, it's very, very common. I'm not talking about our community now, but it applies to our community as well, where you get new into a place and you get rid of everything. Everything was wrong, and we will start from scratch. That is, I mean, I think that there are counted occasions where that has to be the only way to go. I think that, especially in professional sports, the organization has been around enough to have some foundation that you can select what is good and build on that. And that way it's easier to get the buy-in from the whole organization, because it's impossible to get rid of the whole organization. So I think it's more efficient, money-wise, time-wise, and from an empathetic point of view as well, build from the commonalities that you think that work, and then at the same time that you optimize what you think that work, you are more disruptive with things that can be improved, but they won't affect the day-to-day, because disruptive takes time. Disruptive innovation takes time. If it's disruptive, it's because you are not even improving the answer to a question. You're changing the question, and that means a shift on the paradigm. The whole thing changes. And for that, you need time to explain, you need time to educate, and to have results, you need a long time. So we don't have to forget that we have to win games this Sunday. So in order to have that balance between changing a lot a program and evolving a program, you have to find how to do that without stopping the machines and not producing at all.
Is there any examples you can give? And again, please tell me to stop talking about this. But is there any examples you can give where you may have, or someone else, or a previous you may have moved on the process and done something different, when actually you've gone through this process yourself and gone, actually, we can squeeze more out of what we're currently doing rather than moving on to the next thing, and therefore, like you say, the next question?
Yeah, I mean, I have hundreds of examples actually, and unfortunately, it's pretty common to bring someone in professional sports. Actually, I have more examples than non-examples, where the head coach of a soccer team X changes. It takes with him the fitness coach or the director of performance. They move, and then who replaces changes the whole thing, changes the way that data changes the AMS. I mean, the way that we collect the data. I mean, really, that's the first thing that we have to change the way the data is collected. Well, it has to be very, very bad to that being the first step. Or we do that because it was bad, or we do that because that's what we were doing and we are more comfortable, instead of adapting and finding the happy middle between where we are going and where we are coming from. Unfortunately, I think that is more the second thing. You feel comfortable with what you've been doing, and you want to replicate what you are doing. That applies for us in the sports science community, and applies sometimes for coaches, where coaches, instead of adapting to the roster that they have, they want to apply the game style that they have been doing in other teams. If you don't adapt to your roster, doesn't matter how successful you were in the other team, because this roster is completely different. So it happens all the time. I mean, there are plenty of examples, and I'm a true believer on evolution first and revolution second. Revolution, it can be, it's redundant, but it will be a revolution, which implies that it will give you a huge competitive advantage, maybe for a short period of time, but that's enough. That's worth the investment. But you don't have to forget the day-to-day operations. We have to perform every weekend. And in the NBA case, we play every other day. So you have to offer services, elite services, every day. And if you are disruptive from day one, that will suffer. So you have to find the right balance. And examples are lots of examples. Unfortunately, it's very common to get rid of everything that was there and replace it for what you have been doing before, instead of finding the optimization model.
The athlete tracking example is one that I'm familiar with, and you see it all the time. Like, certain practitioners will move, and you just know that practitioner is going to take that athlete tracking company with them and get rid of the old one. And you'll go on Sky Sports, and 2 weeks ago it was one, and now it's another. And you just think, how long does that change actually take? Probably physically, like 2 seconds, because instead of putting one in one pouch, you put the other one in the pouch. But just the workflow of what happens off the back of that, and how long that actually takes, and how much disruption that causes within the workflow of what happens on the reporting side and the analysis side. Like, what happens to all the rest of the data that's gone before it is that
historical data. You lose the power of data doing that. So I agree 100%. Tracking is a very common one, but with DBT is the same, and it's endless. The examples.
So let's move on to the amount of data that we're collecting. So we've mentioned VBT, we've mentioned athlete tracking. We could go on and on and on. How are you guys, or from your experience, what would be the ideal? Not to lean too much on what you're doing at the Spurs, but how can we manage that, and how are you managing that? Because, as we've said, people are adding, and all of a sudden it just gets bigger, and this machine gets bigger. And to actually keep answering them questions, it just gets more complex. So how are you, and how would you advise people to manage that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to have one sentence in mind in terms of data management. You have to be careful at the sentence, very famous, paralysis by analysis, right? You have several guests that have used the same sentence. Yeah. So if you really, it's a very simple sentence, paralysis by analysis. If you have too much data, you have so much data that is overwhelming for you to make sense of that data, the technology that you are getting, that you are using is way too much for your program. So the way that to tackle this is, first, answer a question that you already have. Second, the requirement to the company, the technology company that you decided to implement, has to imply that they have a process, call it API, call it whatever you want, that is skipping the step of having human beings creating CSVs and uploading the CSV into a data, because that's time consuming. That's telling you that gap between data collection and data reporting and data and report generation, it's going to take in between 30 minutes if it's immediate and up to hours. So
the actionability of that information is not immediate, and that's very important. I mean, you have to have a technology that when you collect the data, ideally you have real-time information, but when that is not possible, you have a way that is automatically uploaded in your data manager and the AMS system that you have, and you have there build the report in whatever alarms or communication system that you have set up, that it gives feedback immediately to the strength coach or the basketball coach to change things. That's critical. I mean, having an automatic process from data collection, not having technology that lives in silos. Another very common mistake. You have a VBT system that you have to download that data and put it in your database, or you have a biomechanical system that is really, really cool, but it takes you 3 hours to create the report and put it in. That's not actionable. That is not actionable. That's really cool for research. That is impossible for our context. It's impossible. Our pace is, we fly. Tomorrow is a completely different set. So we need that information. Ideally real time, ideally automatical process, and it has to be answering a question. If all that is in place, the next question for you is how you handle or how you create the report that integrates such amount of data and from different sources. And that's a different question. Is you need knowledge on statistics and pre-advanced knowledge on statistics if you are doing it yourself and your organization doesn't have a analytics department. But if you do have an analytics department, and most professional teams do have someone that is expert on that field, you should engage them, not throw all the shit to them, but having them engaged to help you. How can we build a report that is not just looking at, I'm going to say the word, acute chronic ratio of RPE. I hope that Franco will
not be happy.
It's not about to collapse. I just make it just easy. Whatever the metric you're using, but you have to have the right report that integrates everything properly, because with experts that know how to manage this data, and if you don't have the experts, it's on you to learn how to use that. And that leads us to, okay, what skill sets do I need? Do I need to, is Excel enough? Or do I need to have R or Python in my toolbox? Well, it depends on your organization. If you have a huge amount of data, you will see. You will try with Excel and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's going to get stuck. It's going to get frozen. And the graphs are great, but it takes 5 minutes to actually open the file. It's not going to be implementable. And so that it's going to force you to learn the minimum amount of R, Python, SAS, whatever the platform you want. There are lots of them, because these are platforms that manage huge amounts of information. Do you need to be a data scientist? No. Do you need to be a computer scientist? No. But you need a minimum, because we are objective thinkers that need information, and we need quick ways to give that information and that feedback. So I think that learning tools that speed up that process makes sense. I use this analogy all the time. Is it necessary to be an expert of Excel to be a sports scientist? Well, it's not necessary, but it's better to use Excel than a calculator, right? It's the same. Now, in 2020, is it necessary to have R? Well, if you have R or that kind of programs, you will go faster than with Excel. Calculator, Excel, R, or those type of systems. It's not a must. It's a good skill set to have in your toolkit, if that makes sense.
So that you've answered my question, because my next question was going to be, in 2020 for the up-and-coming sports scientist, is learning to code the best use of time to get a job, keep a job, make yourself indispensable, having them sort of skills?
I think that sports scientists, the most that they have to spend time on, and I'm going to be controversial now, is on
how to improve social skills and empathy. That's the first step. Because if you don't have the buy-in from players, coaches, and strength coaches and medical staff, it's over. Your job is over. It doesn't matter how good you are with R or Excel or with your calculator, it's not going to work. So the first thing that you have to invest time is making sure that you understand the context and the needs in your organization. Now, once you are good at that, and it's trainable, it's something that you can get better. No, I'm not very social and I like to be with my laptop. If that's the case, you will have a hard time in a professional sport, because professional sport is about relationships and getting buy-in from the players and convincing the coaches to use the technology that will give you the data to produce nice reports that will change the season. Your end goal is not to create a beautiful report. Your end goal is to improve and optimize decision-making in your organization. So, and for that, you need to understand context, and for that, you need to improve your social skills to communicate to across departments. That's why I think that sometimes it's not necessary, but it's good to be kind of a generalist. And the book Range it explains it very well. The more, the easier or the more comfortable you feel talking with the different departments, you will achieve that interactivity that is the unicorn in any organization. Is the interaction between all departments, interaction between front office, analytics departments, basketball coaches, strength coaches, medical, business side. And when all that information starts to flow and communicate, then you have to ask the question, okay, what's the best program to use all that information? But if you don't get that interaction, you with Excel, you are fine, because you will have 3 rows of data.
Yeah, very true. You got me interested then when you said about social skills. I'm interested. You perked me. What was the book? What was the book that you mentioned just then?
Range, David Epstein.
Range, David Epstein. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
So you say that these kind of skills can be taught. This has come up a couple of times. Have you any experience of being the person that's teaching them, or seen any good practice for maybe younger sports scientists that maybe do struggle with that social side of things and do struggle to maybe form them relationships or create new relationships with new members of staff? What would be the first port of call for you for anyone looking to improve them kind of skills?
Yeah, I think reading about it, reading about empathy and understanding others and emotional intelligence and the different types of intelligence and collective thinking and so on. Those are topics that you can read about them. But the easiest action for a department, for a young sports scientist is, and this is the recommendation that I give to everyone that I work with, especially when they start. So when the players are in the weight room, you are in the weight room. You are not doing Excel charts and writing code. If the players are in the weight room for 2 hours a day, you have to interact with the players. You don't need to be their friend if you are not comfortable, but you offer your help. You are spotting up. You are helping with BBT, with the data, wherever you feel comfortable. But you have to force yourself to put you in a position where you have to interact with human beings. Otherwise, it's very easy to get in your office writing code and forgetting and just focusing and narrowing your view into that beautiful chart and making sure that you're not missing a comma in your code. That's important, but debugging the code can be done later. Interacting with your players, it's only one opportunity, and it's when the players are in the field. That applies with the players, which is the easiest one, but also with your colleagues in the department. So you have to find, you don't need to read any book. You have to find in your schedule time to spend, to have conversations, and if you want to call it serendipity, call it, use whatever word you want, but you can talk about personal stuff, you can talk about reports, you can talk about training, you can talk about whatever you think, but find a way to interact with your colleagues, because that will give you good ideas on how to do better your next report. Guaranteed.
And on top of those two things, which is forcing yourself to have those interactions, then read about empathy, emotional intelligence, but that's secondary. I mean, the first is action, and the second is reading.
When you first came to the Spurs, how much time did you spend with the coaching staff to understand them, their methodologies, their thoughts, their experiences, because they were NBA champions, so there's plenty to learn there. Did you dedicate time to sit with them guys, talk shop, and just absorb?
To be that honest, so I came from a very different environment. I came from an environment in Spain. I worked with the same coach for several years, so we knew each other extremely well. I knew exactly how the week was for him, tactically speaking and technically speaking, which helps a lot. And I was the one literally in charge of writing the session, the basketball session, and designing the week. And the coach was the one putting the technical and tactical content for the team. So that was the level of integration that we had between us. I was completely new here, so I tried to be very respectful with everyone's time. And I spent a lot of time, months actually, learning with silence. So being a present there, but not interfering with anyone, because it's very common that when the role is new and they listen to the word scientist, there's like a negative reaction. Shit, he's the guy with the numbers. And no, I'm not a zealot of science. I love science. I love the best ways to generate new knowledge, but science also is slow, and we need fast pace. So I try to find the best way to learn more, to provide objective information. And the way that I found personally, and this can change depending on the organization, is with very respectful silence. Once they saw me not as a threat, if you want to call it, it was easier to open discussions. And probably the first discussions weren't at all about basketball. As I said before, it was more learning. Okay, you just won an NBA championship. That's pretty cool, right? So, and learning from the informal conversations to get formal information. That's also the way I am personally. This is not an advice, a generic advice. I like to work in the shadow. I don't need the spotlights, and learning first and talking second. I think it's a general good advice.
Excellent. I've got one last topic for you, which may be big, it may be small, but we'll see how it goes. And that's high intensity interval training, based on your involvement with Martin and Paul with HIIT Science. They'll enjoy that. I've given them a shout out, so they can pay me later. So, pay us. Sorry, pay us. So to start with, just to set the scene, so team sport environment, whether that be whatever it may be, but your guiding principles when it comes to HIIT training.
The first thing that I say, and this is something that maybe I think we are on the same page with Martin and Paul, but in team sports, the way I put conditioning in general is based on specificity, how similar it is to the actual requirements or game, and I think that the metabolic obviously is important, but it's not the priority number one. Meaning, the way that we build conditioning in any teams that I've been in Spain with the national team and here, it's not as much of let's try to build a program to improve the aerobic threshold or the anaerobic threshold or the VO2 max for this player. That's secondary, and we know what's the emphasis of that exercise in those areas, but it's not the other way around. With this, I mean that how you integrate sport-specific movements, decision-making, the court, the ball, and the teammates are step number one. And step number two is the physiological aspects of that task, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
To do that, I wrote a paper in Spanish, in Catalan actually, back in 2009, explaining the foundation of this. And the foundation of this is based on Paco Cirulo. It's a methodologist, very popular in Spain. Paco Cirulo, Gerard Moras, another methodologist in volleyball, same structure, and Julio Toes, a strength coach, pretty popular, that he applied it specifically for strength. Based on these three authors, I did my own adaptation for basketball. And then in 2013 with Lorena Torres, we did the conditioning part and the strength part. So there are two papers trying to explain how to progress in specificity, and we have different levels based on those four authors that goes from generic, directed, special, and competitive. And basically what helps you is to say, okay, how close you are to mimic the game demands. Are you above the game demands or you are below the game demands? And the main reason of this is not physiological. And this is very important to keep in mind. The main reason to do this is to have the coaches, basketball coaches, engaged and make them understand that there is a continuum. There is no strength, conditioning, player development or skill acquisition and the rest, and team practices and game. No. Everything is part of the same player development, from more generic to more specific. And you can split that in a strength focus or conditioning focus. But don't forget that when you are actually running on court and doing aggressive change of directions all out, which is part of one of the contents in our conditioning program or proposal, you are also developing strength, specific strength. And this is very important also to understand for the strength coaches. So our goal with the power and the strength paper and the conditioning paper was to put together everyone involved in the player development process: basketball coaches, strength coaches, medical staff, sports science, trying to explain that we have to be with more or less emphasis in each one of the levels, all have to be involved. And you can cover every need for the player, from social, cognitive, technical, conditioning, with one task. But you have different modulators. These tasks will be more social and fun, and then we will put in the warm-up, and then the strength and the conditioning will be very low in that modulator. And this is for sprint interval training, that Martin calls it, and Paul calls it, and we will use a ball with 1 on 0, and we will do this specific movement, but it's in the same continuum. I think that that's a game changer once the organization, and it's not one person, it's when the organization clicks and understands that there is a continuum, and the strength is everywhere. And the strength is part of conditioning, and conditioning implies strength. And you don't need to understand aerobic and aerobic threshold, VO2 max, or deceleration force, acceleration force, hypertrophy. Everything is part of the same, and you have to build it as a whole. And I think that that's what we tried, and we keep. We are working on another paper on that regard. It's trying to have everyone involved in the player development process. And I think we are very proud of that chapter, and we thank Paul and Martin to give us the chance to share it, because they are the rock stars, and you too. So it's good that you give me the chance to share this thought. But I think that's the beauty. Don't go too functional, because that's crazy. But you have to understand the process between generic and competitive.
So just dumbing this down for a simpleton like myself, when it comes to designing that sort of practice with all these different departments or different practitioners involved, how do we then? It sounds complicated. Well, it doesn't. It sounds simple, but then thinking about it from a practical point of view, with all these different inputs to actually getting a drill that does what you want it to do on paper and then implement it.
Yeah, the easiest way to understand what we are trying to communicate is the following. So if you have every exercise, as we do, we are not the only ones. Everyone has a way to classify. They have a drill book to say that these are the demands for sprint distance, high speed running, acceleration, deceleration, and then we add one more. That is, let's call it specificity or cognitive load, some authors call it, being, just to simplify, 5-on-5, official 5-on-5, official game is a 10, and then doing a leg extension is 0.5. You have all kind of exercises. Swimming is a 0.75 because it's unrelated to basketball. And then you have every exercise with those values, the physiological metrics, if you want to call it, or the metabolic requirements, and then the cognitive requirements. When you try to convince a strength coach or a basketball coach on how we structure the week and how you find the balance between one thing and the other, you will find that sometimes if you have no control, depending on the methodology, but just being generic on the explanation, that sometimes we are too specific. There are coaches that just play games, scrimmage all the time, couple free throws in between, and that's it. So you will have that if you have 60 minutes practice and you have 40 of those minutes are actual 5-on-5 and a few free throws, you'll have that the value for that session is very close to 10. It's going to be 8 point something because you are playing all the time, right? But we know that overusing or being too specific in strength and conditioning instead of complementing what's happening on court can provoke overuse injuries. So if you showed that graph showing that today was very close to game demands to the strength coach, and the strength coach, yeah, but I had for today planned to do power and plyometrics for this player. Wow, but you know that the demands on a game is jumping, high intensity accelerations, decelerations, lots of power. I mean, it's really hard for you to mimic the power that the guy has been doing on court right now. And you explain that to them. It's very easy to convince them that they are actually overdoing the same orientation. And that applies for conditioning as well. So, and it's reversed. So how can we find the happy middle because we all talk about individualization. What is individualization? Well, in order to individualize, you have to know, first of all, the loads, metabolic and cognitive for that session, but not only at team level, but at player level. Now tracking technology can allow you to tag the players, and we do that, all the teams do that, and then you will have, in basketball, it's the best example, we have 10 players playing basketball, but you have a roster of 15. So there are 5 players that are sitting. So if you only use the team practice cognitive load, you will have 8.9 for everyone. And you will apply the same criteria with the strength coach. No one will do plyometrics or power. And that's not true. So there are 5 players that can actually do it because they weren't exposed. Their load actually is 2. So they can actually, and probably they would benefit of doing that because they didn't have exposure. So that type of conversation is what the numbers and the structure that we are proposing in the strength and conditioning papers are trying to show you. It's a way to everyone involved in the player development process, not just look at the process with the narrow lenses of strength, conditioning, player development, or team practice, but looking at the bigger picture and seeing the exposure of every single player and how we better complement each one of the players to have the whole spectrum that is required in sports. That makes sense?
Makes absolute sense. Superb. Thank you for that. We're coming up to an hour and a half that I've actually kept you because we started chatting beforehand, which I've kept you far too long. So, just to round this up, because I know you're a busy man, if anyone wants to have further chats with you, get in touch, follow your work, where's the best place for them to go? Is Twitter the best place?
Yeah, I'm not the most active guy, but I'm there. I read almost every day. So yeah, and I try to share everything that I do there. So yeah, Xhelling at Xhelling. That's my handle.
Cool. And any research? You mentioned 1 or 2 there, but any research projects coming down the pipe that people can look forward to?
I think that it's about to be published probably next week. We just finished with Sam Robertson like a framework on decision support systems and
informed decisions in professional organizations. Pretty detailed. It's kind of a review on what check marks you have to follow for when developing a decision support system in an organization, which it's a little bit of everything that we discussed: technology, data management, workflows, implementation, integration, etc. So it's about to be published, and then lots of other things related to. Now I'm doing research on informed decisions and optimization of decisions in organizations. So a couple more papers in the oven.
So just you and Sam on that first one you mentioned, or is there more authors on that?
Just Sam and me.
Sam's superb.
Yeah,
Sam is fantastic.
Sam is great. Good colleague, good friend.
Brilliant.
A rock star like you, actually.
Oh, stop it. He's a good guy. He's a great guy. I've spoken to him a couple of times. Met him over here actually when he came to the UK. So that was a pleasure. But thank you very much, Xavi. I will let you get on with your afternoon. This afternoon there. And thank you again. Really appreciate it. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks again for what you do. I think that this platform is awesome, and having access to so many brilliant minds is really cool. And this is the result of technology, as we were speaking before, right? I mean, it's really cool to have so much free access. So thanks, Rob.
It is my pleasure. Thanks, mate. Speak soon.
Thank you. Bye.